a more resilient global economy. That is what we are about to discuss here with quite the lineup of guests. It is such an honor to be here, to be starting off this fabulous conference with you all. I'm Caroline Hyde from Bloomberg Television. And we now want to dig into where we've been, where we are, where we're going to go, what prescriptions we can hope for policymaking, how we can connect, how we can build a stronger economy, inclusion, resilience, rebuilding, better future for taking future risks on as well. All of these things are things we must now tackle with a wonderful array of participants. I want to welcome Keisha Lance-Bottoms, Mayor Keisha Lance-Bottoms, of course, Mayor of Atlanta. We've got Glenn Hutchins, co-chair of the Brookings Institution, chair of North Island Ventures and co-founder, of course, of Silver Lake, so private equity as well. Odile Renaud-Basso will be joining us. She is president of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD. Bruce Carnegie-Brown, chairman of Lloyd's, of course, a banker his life, but now focusing in on the risks from a private market perspective. And Kuben, Naidoo, deputy governor of South African Reserve Bank, CEO of South African Prudential Authority, of course, a bank regulator. Mesdames and messieurs, Mr. and Mrs., it is wonderful to have you all here. Thank you very much indeed. And I want to get a take from all of you to kick this off about where you see us now, how gargantuan is the issue at hand, and really whether you think the vaccine, the hope of a vaccine where we are is enough to set us right from a global economic perspective, or whether a new economic foundation is needed. I want to please start with Odile Renaud-Basso, if she can hear us, president of the EBRD. Are we in need of a new economic foundation, Odile?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I just joined, so I'm just jumping in because I had trouble with connection. Yes, indeed, we are facing huge challenges because the economic crisis related to the COVID crisis, the pandemic, is indeed still very acute. And I think when we look at the countries in which we intervene, we all see most of them will be either in recession or with much, much lower growth than expected. And it's even worse in a number of very developed countries where the recession is double digit. So I think that indeed the economic impact is huge. And of course, the vaccine opens up perspective and will provide solution over time. But the question is what will be the next 6 months and how far the economic situation will continue to be very weak and possibly to deteriorate. I mean, there is a bit of uncertainty, a large amount of uncertainty around this question mark. Then the issue is, of course, what can we do? And a lot has been done by all national government and also international institutions in order to support the economy, to avoid a total collapse and to support companies, SMEs, households, to weather this very difficult situation. Fiscal support has been very important. In our countries of operation, overall fiscal stimulus represents 4% of GDP. It has been bigger in some countries than others, but this represents a big effort. But of course, the issue is that everybody focus on the short term, emergency support, liquidity support, rescheduling of debt, and so forth. And we need still to be able to tackle big challenges. And the key focus, I think everybody is still talking about building back better. But I think this will be the big challenge in the coming months to support, and to address, for example, the climate challenge, but also the issue of inequalities, equal opportunities that needs to be addressed while continuing to provide support to the short-term economy.
I think Odile has just gone through a large list of issues that we want to be tackling throughout this conversation, a wonderful way to set us up. Glenn Hutchins, your perspective on really, first and foremost, whether we can just relaunch ourselves post-vaccine or whether a new economic foundation is needed.
Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with the conference in Montreal again. I think we don't have any choice. Look, I think the vaccine is a phenomenal accomplishment. It reminds us of the power of innovation and the importance of science. We have a safe, effective, and durable vaccine. And that's fantastic. And I think as a consequence of which we're going to get out of this pandemic. But once we are out of it, certainly in the developed world, there's no going back to the economy we had before. Whether you wanted it or not, it's not going to be there. We have fundamentally changed the way we work, the way we shop, the way we teach, the way we entertain, and the way we deliver healthcare, and none of those are changing. I can go through some of these later, but very, very quickly. It's not just going on Amazon. Grocery shopping and drug shopping, which was always the place where foot traffic came to physical retail, has been fundamentally disintermediated by delivery services. DoorDash went public this week at something like 200 times revenue. And the way we shop is changing. People aren't going to one-stop shop anymore. They're deconstructing their shopping cart and buying from lots of different sources, many of which come directly to the consumer from the producer. Fundamental change way in which we shop. Obviously, we're working in very different ways. We're telecommuting. That's not going to stop. Lots of businesses have adopted that. Teaching will never be the same again. The university business model will be fundamentally changed by all this remote education, how much cheaper it is. Entertaining, we're now streaming movies to our homes rather than going to movie theaters. That's not going to go back to major theatrical distribution. And TikTok shows us how consumers are generating their own entertainment. Treating, massive amount of healthcare is now being delivered via these Zoom type of services. That won't change, and doctors have actually found a way that they can actually schedule us now rather than have to sit around their offices for hours waiting for them to be ready for it. We could go on, but the other thing, of course, is work. Is real estate. We don't use real estate the same way anymore. We don't need as much real estate. There'll be health safety precautions that'll be in place. We'll need more of it per person. So the fundamental way in which we interact with the economy and the nature of the economy will change ineluctably, regardless of whether we'd like it to be that way or not.
An amazing array of the way in which the private sector, the public sector are currently interfacing, coming from, of course, Mr. Hutchins. Mayor Lance Bottoms, your perspective on how you're seeing this new economy. Are we needing a new economic foundation, a new prescription of the way in which we serve people and which we look from the government to serve the public and indeed the private sector to interact with that?
Certainly, and Glenn really hit the nail on the head. I'm not an expert on the economy, but I can tell you just from my day-to-day oversight over a city that is the anchor of the 10th largest economy in the United States, everything has changed. And what is most troubling for me as a leader is the uncertainty of what that change means. We've seen a decline in our revenues. There are revenue bonds that have been downgraded. There are hotel, motel taxes that we aren't receiving into our coffers, and the list goes on. And so this, I really see where we are now as phase one. And then phase two is how do we navigate and sustain? And interestingly enough, what we are seeing in Atlanta is something that's being seen across the United States, and I would venture to say across the globe. Those sectors of our community that were already living on the margins and hurting before COVID-19 are hurting even more. And we are seeing the equity divide play out in real time, not just in our health disparities, but also with kitchen table economics. So what we've had to do at the most basic level in the city of Atlanta is we've not reopened City Hall and we've allowed people to telework. Our frontline employees are our sanitation workers. They are our parks and recreation workers who we've now had to transition to delivering meals to seniors and to kids who rely on free lunch and breakfast at school. And so it is the unknown that really concerns me. And that is the reason it's going to be extremely important as our Congress continues to look at assistance for people across the country, that there be a specific look at municipalities and states, because we're going to have huge budget deficit shortfalls that are going to impact all of our communities.
Well said, Mayor. And I think that's what's so important about this conference is as we face this uncertainty, what policy prescriptions we can hope for, that we can wish for, that we can already see being put in place. And it's so wonderful to see people are actually already informing governments and leading institutions from a global narrative here. Let's put this same question, though, to keep the narrative going with Bruce, of course, Bruce Carnegie-Brown, your private sector perspective here. Of course, Chairman of Lloyd's, you're looking at the insurance impact of COVID, just gargantuan, sort of 2 trillion. You're already saying there are lessons to be learned. But from your perspective, do we need to look at the insurance sector and indeed the economy at large in a fundamentally different way coming out of COVID? I think you're muted, Bruce.
A schoolboy error, excuse me.
We all do it.
I mean, the pandemic is one of those events that is just too large for any private solution to the risks presented. And there are others out there in the world, but the nature of insurance, for instance, is, of course, to collect the premiums of the many and to pay the claims of the few. And what we see in the pandemic is that this is everywhere at the same time. And of course, most of us don't even know when it started, and we certainly don't know yet when it will finish. And so trying to get your arms around this is incredibly difficult. And so the default position in terms of backstop for this does default to governments. And we see that in the huge amounts of economic stimulus being put into every economy around the world. And it is very difficult for insurance to respond because of the scale of capital required and because of the probability of events. Insurance is supposed to provide for unexpected losses in specific times for specific amounts. And all of this, as we go through the pandemic, is unlimited. But in my view, when I have conversations with governments, it's an issue of governments understanding that they own this risk ultimately unless they partner with other people. And I think the private sector has a role to play in supporting government around building resilience as we look to the future. And we have some quite good examples of this in our economies around the world already, in things like flood insurance and terrorism, where there are partnerships between government and private enterprise to build more resilience back into the economy for these kinds of events that are otherwise kind of uninsurable in the private sector. The challenge at the moment is twofold, really. One is governments are very focused on the here and now. They've got a huge problem to be dealing with now, and therefore they don't have enough resource to be thinking about the next pandemic or the next systemic issue for countries around the world. And secondly, of course, governments never have any money, or they certainly don't have enough money anyway, and they certainly have even less than they started with, having gone through this pandemic. And so as we kind of try to build back better, we're building back better in an environment where governments have fewer and fewer resources than they even had before. And so I'm a little bit more pessimistic than the comments made by Glenn earlier, that things fundamentally change, because in order for things fundamentally to change in terms of building more resilience back into our economies, we have to make very substantial investments, and that's going to be very difficult to pay for alongside all of the financial support already provided to economies around the world.
Let's talk about paying that, and let's just finish off this sort of train of thought with Kuben Naidoo, of course, Deputy Governor of the South African Reserve Bank. Your perspective, sir, on sort of financing this. You're the bank regulator of South Africa. You're already looking at how banks are managing to repurpose themselves and help fuel some of the rebuilding that we talk of, that we hope will be stronger. From your perspective, is the economy rebuilding itself necessarily in a totally different way, or are we just going back from where we left off post-vaccine?
Thanks, Caroline, and good morning to everyone. Let me start off. You asked earlier about the vaccine. I mean, in developing countries, we only scheduled to get the vaccine around third quarter of next year. So you start to see the first types of inequalities with the vaccine being rolled out already. We will get the first doses around September next year. Probably 10 months after advanced economies, and I'm probably sure there are other countries further behind in the queue. Because this is a global health pandemic, unless you immunize most people, or at least most vulnerable people, actually you're not going to be able to put an end to the pandemic and an end to the economic effects of the pandemic until certainly a large proportion, not all, but a large proportion of the world is immunized or is vaccinated. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that I do agree with the previous speaker that I think that governments are probably in a worse position to respond to some of the issues because of higher levels of debt, because of worse fiscal positions, and therefore the future is going to be increasingly uncertain. There's been several trends before COVID, digitization, the issue around inequality. Economists have this term called a returns to skills curve, or skills bias technological change. To put simply, it's that the more skilled you are, the higher your increase in income has been over the last 20 years, and the lower skilled you are, the smaller your increase in income has been. Technology is accelerating that at a phenomenal pace. So the COVID crisis has accelerated certain trends in society that could make things a lot worse, right? It could increase inequality quite sharply. Technology may also have the solutions to try and intervene to be able to provide good quality public services to poorer people. But unless we get over that technological divide and unless we get over that skills divide, we're going to have a situation of rising inequality. And I don't think that that's positive. I think we're going to have to think hard about how the world deals with that. I don't think we can afford to tolerate further increases in inequality, which may be accelerated upon by the developments that COVID has brought about.
I'm so glad, Mr. Naidoo, that yourself and indeed Mayor Lance-Bottoms have both discussed the so-called K-shaped equality economy that we're building, the inequality in the system that we're seeing. And I want to return, therefore, back to yourself, Glenn, because we heard from Bruce sort of challenging perhaps some of your optimism there. You're a man who knows technology well. You set up a VC to be able to, and private equity to plow money into the new economy. You were talking about the digitization, the way in which the economy has already fundamentally changed with DoorDash and the like. But you're also a man who advises government, and you advise, of course, from a policy perspective, the current now Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Your perspective, therefore, Glenn, on what authorities' role is here with the inequality, with the necessary waiting for a vaccine, and whether or not policy making is fit for the purpose.
Look, I think that Bruce, Carnegie-Brown, Kuben, Naidoo have said something very important, which is this crisis is much larger than private industry can deal with. In the United States, it's very important that, in my view, that we have a very substantial stimulus. We need about $2 trillion. It looks like we're going to get about $1 trillion. And that needs, in my view, to be targeted to the people who are the most affected by this crisis. And that is the people who live in vulnerable communities, not just of color, but particularly those, as well as workers whose jobs have been disproportionately impacted by this. And personally, that needs to be focused on immediate assistance to these folks in the form of what has proven to be the most powerful, which is extended and expanded unemployment insurance, but also help for cities, schools, hospitals, et cetera. I also am involved in the international development community. I co-chair CARE, which is headquartered in Atlanta, where we have one of the best mayors in the country, Keisha Bottoms. And I've had an opportunity as a result of which to understand how, as Kuben says, developing and poorer countries are disproportionately impacted by this as a consequence, not only of, but primarily of poor infrastructure around public health care, delivery of medicines, and especially the vaccine. And he's right. We absolutely have to. This has to be thought of not just as a national effort in the United States, where I spend most of my time thinking about policy, but also an international effort because a global pandemic requires global solutions. And if we fail to get that part of it right, we will have failed fundamentally in dealing with this crisis.
Let's talk about the international perspective before we go to Mayor Bottoms again. I want to ask you, Odile, of course, you are looking from European perspective, but that is an international perspective, and there are still quote unquote emerging markets within Europe as they stand. How are you looking at the vaccine rollout? How are you looking at the authorities' reaction from a government perspective, and then from you, from a supranational perspective, at tackling these sorts of immediate problems?
I mean, I think that as far as the vaccine is concerned, but also the very short-term immediate needs, it's quite striking to say that there has been an important effort from the international community, starting with the IMF, who provided, the IMF has never provided such a large packet emergency support, financing for the poorest countries, all the emerging countries and so forth. So without conditions, without program, just immediate support. This has been very effective, quite rapid. It's not enough. And there are a lot of ongoing discussion, for example, in the international community about debt relief, because we know that in a number of countries, that situation is becoming very difficult to sustain, unsustainable, and that there has been some short-term debt relief provided, postponement of payment, but we will probably need a new initiative with much more in-depth debt restructuring. This is to provide, the objective of all this was to provide some sort of relief for the government to be able to focus on emergency support to the health sector and so forth. Now there is a lot of reflection ongoing and action ongoing in financing vaccine and supporting developing countries to step in with vaccine. We know that, this will be a public good, as it was said before, by a number of interventions. We need to deal correctly with that, because otherwise, if we do not provide the necessary support for the poorest countries, it will come back in any case. We know that this kind of pandemic is a global issue, and we need to address it together. This will require a lot of coordination, a lot of political willingness and commitment, because, of course, there is huge pressure on national government to deal with their own national objective first. So I think that's one issue which is very important. When we think about rebuilding also, I think that in a way we can have policies that will have two objectives at the same time: the recovery and relaunching the economy, because the problem is that a number of economies, in particular those which were strongly dependent on tourism, are facing huge challenges, and you see huge decrease of turnover and so forth. So we need to support them in the short term, as done, for example, in the US or in Europe, to support the activity, but also to prepare for the future. And when we talk about preparing for the future, I think that it's still very uncertain how far the changes will be in the behavior, in the way of consumption and so forth. There may be, when the crisis will be over, the pandemic crisis will be over, we may return back to normal in a number of situations. And I'm not sure how deep will be the changes. I think that Glenn make a very clear statement that it will be a revolution and nothing will be back to normal as before. I'm not so sure, and I think there will be changes, but also we will come back to some of the. But this, even in this context, I think that because we know the magnitude, for example, of the climate change challenges and so forth, we really need to focus that the recovery will take that into account, this long-term dimension into account. And this can be helpful on both grounds, in the long term, but also to sustain the activity in the short term.
Well said. Sustainability and climate change still so much of a focus. Let's get back to the 60th mayor of Atlanta. Keisha, your perspective, we're hearing from Glenn there, and indeed hearing from Odile, the focus on debt, and you were mentioning it before, debt, but also the inequality that you're seeing building in your system. From your perspective, of course, we await further stimulus coming from a fiscal perspective in the US, and every single, I think, central banker in the world is asking for fiscal support from whatever government might be. The US is not alone there. But in terms of how it helps your municipalities, how it helps states in particular, what is it that you really need in terms of policy making right now?
Well, what we need is equity. And even as you think of Atlanta, in the state of Georgia, we were the only city to receive direct funding from the federal government under the CARES Act, because we were able to surpass the 500,000 population threshold. No other city in our state received direct assistance. And even with that assistance, it was very specific as to how we could use it. We could not use it for debt service. We can't use it to fill gaps in our operating budget. But what we have been able to do is to use it for rental and homeowner assistance. We've been able to set up learning pods across our city. There were children who literally had been on the playground since March, not accessing digital learning, because in so many communities, there is no access to digital learning. And even in households, you have households with parents and grandparents who have to go to work every day, or perhaps don't have the education level to assist kids with what they need for school. And even at that, we've only been able to service 200 kids out of a public school population of more than 50,000 because of COVID restrictions. And so it's going to be extremely important that as the next round of funding goes out, that it go to all cities, that it go to all counties, because every need is different in every single city and county. And it is also going to be extremely important that cities have flexibility with these needs. My needs may be very different from needs in New York or in Birmingham or even in Augusta, Georgia, but nobody knows their communities better than hopefully a mayor and those at the local level. And so we're going to need flexibility, and we are going to need direct funding for us to be able to survive this.
Really putting it so into perspective of the need on the ground right now from individuals, from public natures and roles, but also in the private sector perspective, how we can see some sort of evolution there. And Bruce, your perspective on what the private sector role is right here, right now, and how you're looking to tackle being able to be a support system in the future when insurance just hasn't been able to tackle this black swan event in the way that many would have hoped.
Well, a couple of comments, Caroline. First, actually, a story of encouragement. Lloyd is working with Gavi, the global vaccine agency, to help with the storage and transportation of these vaccines around the world. And Kuben talked about the challenge with emerging markets being at the back of the queue. But one of the big challenges in getting vaccines into emerging markets, particularly in tropical parts of the world, is that they have to be stored and transported in very, very safe conditions. And we all know that the Pfizer vaccine, in fact, has to be stored at minus 70 degrees, which is, even in a developed economy, a really hard thing to try to execute on from a logistics point of view. To try to do that in emerging markets with much less developed infrastructure is a much bigger challenge. And so we've been partnering with Gavi using a technology that was actually first proposed within our Lloyd's lab, so long before the pandemic started, of putting sensors essentially into transportation containers that allow us to monitor the condition of the drugs as they're transported, and off the back of that, then to underwrite insurance to protect the value of those assets as they're transported around the world. And so, that's a good example of private enterprise trying to respond to the pandemic in a way that provides commercial benefit, but also immediate support. Longer term, we've been trying to talk to governments about what we call Black Swan Re, which is essentially trying to get them to consider partnerships between government and the insurance industry globally, not just around another pandemic, because who's to say that the next systemic risk is going to be a pandemic, but around something that provides more protection for a variety of potential challenges. If you'd asked me what the biggest systemic risk facing the world was before this pandemic arrived, I'd have told you it would be some kind of systemic cyber risk. And it still might be the next risk that we face. And so, while we've done good work around terrorism and flood insurance, as we talked about before, all of the funding around those issues is actually tied up in flood and terrorism insurance. It's not become available to be used in support of the pandemic. And so we're trying to argue for governments thinking more broadly about multiple systemic risks when they set up these partnerships. And then what happens in these partnerships is that the government takes the loss, but private enterprise builds up capital against these risks over time, and that's a way of effectively transferring the risk out of government agencies into the private sector over time in a sustainable way. And I think those kind of partnerships make a huge amount of sense in terms of sharing these risks between public enterprise and the private enterprise.
Public-private partnership has been something that's been sort of really put to the test and exerted it in many ways incredibly efficiently, certainly in the way that the banks have helped roll out PPP over in the United States, able to get loans to small and medium-sized enterprises. Yes, there were issues with the way in which it was first spent, but needs must, and we saw it done pretty effectively. I want to get the emerging market perspective here, because from your perspective, Kuben, of course, looking at the financial sector role in South Africa at the moment, how have you lent upon private business, such as banks, to be able to distribute aid as quickly as possible to not only individuals, but also municipalities, but notably the private sector as well? Have you seen something as effective in South Africa as we have in, say, America, or indeed it's been a government-led solution perhaps in the UK and across in Europe?
Thanks. The government role in terms of fiscal support, the monetary policy response in terms of lower interest rates, financial market responses such as QE and buying government bonds, and banking sector regulatory relief have all been a part of a package. They've been complementary. Unlike the financial crisis 2008-9, where the banks were amplifiers of the crisis, in this case, the banks have been mitigators of the crisis. They have dampened the crisis. They've contributed positively to the recovery. They've contributed positively to household wealth and income and firms' ability to be able to survive. You could argue that, yes, we would have liked them to have done more. But in general, the banks have played a positive role in supporting households, their customers, and businesses to manage this crisis. And I think that that's a real positive. And it's only a positive because the banking sector is more resilient today. In 2008-9, we had an extremely fragile banking sector, especially in advanced economies. Today, globally, including in developed countries, we've got a much more resilient banking system. 8-9 months into the worst economic crisis since the Depression. I mean, the job losses in South Africa have been 2.5-3 times that level in the financial crisis. But we've not had any of the banks go under. We've not had any major banking crisis in any major economy. And I think that that's a positive.
Mayor Bottoms, Keisha, your perspective there in corporate responsibility and how it's managed to weather this storm, because I've had the good fortune of speaking to Killer Mike, of course, a man you know very well, who's helped setting up a digital bank, Greenwood, over in Georgia, because he doesn't feel banks are there particularly for people of color, particularly the unbanked, those who have been left behind. Banks can only help those that already perhaps had a relationship with them. How much have you felt that private sector has been able to help the citizens of your city?
Oh, the private sector has been extremely helpful to our city, and we call it combining commerce with compassion. Ironically enough, back in March, when I received my first download on COVID-19, I was in a meeting in a boardroom with about 30 CEOs and other city leaders. There's a group called the Atlanta Committee for Progress, and they meet with me once a quarter. It allows me the opportunity to bring to them initiatives that I would like to push forward in the city of Atlanta and perhaps may not have the resources or the bandwidth to make it come to fruition. We were sitting in a room together when Dr. Carlos Del Rio from Emory University told us that we had just a matter of days to make some very drastic decisions about closing down the city. I share that with you because it made my job so much easier, even in that moment, to be able to walk out of there on the same page as the CEO of Delta Airlines and the Home Depot and the list goes on, to be able to make the decisions we had to make at that time. And what's been again, extremely helpful, even at the most basic level, as we are looking at our reopening plans for the day when we are able to reopen City Hall, to have corporate leaders share with us what their plans are and what they've had an opportunity to look at in terms of data and metrics, because there are limits to government. We have limited resources. We have limited employee capacity and bandwidth. But when we are able to partner with the private sector, it makes our job that much easier. And additionally, even giving donations to our ATL Strong Fund. The private companies in Atlanta have been extremely helpful with that. It's allowed us to put money directly in the pockets of small business owners who had to close, help with funding to help repair their businesses after the social unrest over this summer. We have a Strength and Beauty Fund for hairstylists and barbers, et cetera. So it has been extremely helpful. And as I talk with mayors across the country, I see that we are the envy of a lot of other cities because of that partnership.
Keisha, you rightly remind us that this wasn't just a health crisis. This wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a social crisis. And it was evident by the protests that we saw on the streets, not only in the US, but across the United Kingdom, across Europe, across every country to a certain extent. Glenn, your perspective, therefore, on corporate responsibility and standing up to the moment that is not just a health and an economic crisis, but a social crisis. We've seen many businesses actually take great action when it comes to trying to have a more equal board, for example, trying to have more representation within their midst, trying to speak to the E, the S, and the G right now. Do you think it's enough?
Look, let me come at that from a slightly different perspective. I think one of the things that's certain here is that absent the innovation that came from laboratories in the United States and Europe, we would not have this vaccine ready to go. And so the importance of businesses just doing what businesses do, innovating and producing their product, can't be diminished. They have to be important players in the community. Many of them have, and will continue to. But I think this understanding that the private sector innovation is what has led the way out of this crisis for us, very fundamentally. But I think one way to answer your question is to think about the next big challenge. We were warned about this pandemic. Not this pandemic, we were warned about the potential for a pandemic. We've been warned about the potential for cyber problems. We have one of the largest cyber breaches in history going on right now in the United States, if you read about it. But I personally think that the next big existential threat is climate change. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot like this pandemic in that we can see it's coming. When it's upon us, it will be too late to solve it. The science has been politicized in ways that make it impossible, very hard, if not impossible, to address fundamental underlying issues. But like this pandemic, if we don't get out ahead of it with public-private partnerships of the sort that you've been describing, and businesses taking you might say it's an ESG point of view, which I think is a good one, but it's also an existential threat to those businesses themselves. So I think it's in their self-interest, in addition to being in the socially responsible thing to do to deal with this. And I hope that this pandemic, which we have a path out of now, will give us the resolve and serve as a warning to spend the next decades going after this much more fundamental and much more dangerous problem.
Odile, this is something you already have paid lip service to earlier, talking about the necessity of governments that are so strapped for cash at the moment, so under duress from a health and economic, social crisis, but they can't take their eye off the longer term ball that is climate change, that is sustainability. How are you seeing your governments that you oversee, that you help fund tackling this? How much is EBRD trying to step in for the Building Back Better perspective?
No, so for us, we really see the need to step up the financing and the investment in this area and to support the transition. That's why, for example, we set up for our own target to reach 50% of our financing to be green financing, so to support the economy, the green transition. But of course, the big challenge will be for government getting out of the crisis with higher debt level, with lower GDP, with the issue of inequalities, is how you manage to address these different challenges at the same time and ensure that you still have the capacity to address this climate change issue. And the point I was trying to make is that in a way, to kickstart the economy, you need to invest and to step up investment, and investment in green transition is a way to do it. And I know a lot of countries which are currently planning some sort of recovery plan, which will get a big focus on green transition. But this is not the whole story, because, for example, we were talking about social inequalities, and one of the big challenges in the countries which have the biggest effort to do to green the economy. For example, we work in a number of countries which are very high dependent on coal, and for them, the cost of transition and how to ensure that it's just and we support, they have the mean and the capacity to support the people most affected by the transition. This is a big challenge. And this, in a way, this is something we have not discussed so much, but this is also a political challenge, because we need to ensure that the way this is done and the transition is implemented get the support of the citizen. Otherwise, we may get into big trouble at the political level with unrest and lack of support from citizens if they believe that this is not done in a fair manner and sustainable manner.
Kuben, to speak to the social angle of this, and in fact, we've got a question coming from the audience asking about the concern about inequality, one that you spoke to so well to start off this whole conference discussion, but also the digital divide that we're currently seeing accentuated, the work from home, the fact that we are all very fortunately sat here with relatively good Wi-Fi and able to take part in this international conference via Zoom. But many, as Mayor Keisha has said, don't have access to the internet right now. How is that something that you're looking at in the emerging markets, looking at in South Africa, to try and tackle to ensure that we don't accentuate inequality by the fact that we now have this new paradigm shift in the economy where we can work from home that much more?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can work from home. You can work from home. The guys at the corner coffee shop can't work from home. Somebody whose job it is to pick up litter in the street cannot work from home. Somebody whose job it is to cut grass on the side of a highway cannot work from home. And these are real divides. We've done extremely well in trying to roll out sort of broadband and Wi-Fi into poor communities and get devices into poor communities. And that has made a huge positive impact on people's access to content. But there is still a divide. What we're seeing is that having access to technology is great, and access to technology is good for inclusivity. But we're not yet at the point where people are able to earn an income from that. We're not yet at the point where that's people's jobs, right? Where people are in that sector to produce, to innovate. They're using it for all sorts of things, but not yet to work. And I do think that that's the next great big leap, to get people to use technology to be able to earn an income and market their businesses, run their businesses.
Let's talk about the next great leap and perhaps the negative side of the equation first. Bruce, your perspective, you're a man who has to think about the next systemic risk. You said that you thought it would be a cyber attack, and we're already seeing that being unfolded in the United States, as Glenn speaks to. What about yourself preparing, and how private sector, public sector prepares for the next great risk? What is it?
I join with Glenn in thinking that climate change sits alongside cyber risk as being the two biggest systemic risks out there. And some of this is about human behavior. It's all a bit about probability times impact. And, for most people, a lot of these things appear quite remote. And Glenn talked about the problem with climate change being the tragedy of the timeline, that by the time we really focus on the issue, it will be too late. And actually, pandemics are no different. At Lloyd's, we produced what looks today to be quite a prescient report in 12 years ago on the risk of pandemic around the world. And we produced policies to try to help companies build their resistance to this issue. The challenge is that nobody bought those policies because they didn't perceive the risk to be high enough on their risk registers to be worth paying the money for. And everybody is kind of short of dollars for investing in resilience, and people prioritize other things. And typically people prioritize the immediate over things that are less visible and more distant in terms of their impact. And that's where I think governments absolutely have to take the lead. But as we've heard, most of this costs a lot of money. Building resilience is not a cheap issue. There's also a significant issue around business models. Most private enterprise business models are rewarded for top-line growth, bottom-line growth, for lean inventories, for just-in-time delivery. And all of those things are actually subject to attack from a resilience point of view, whether by pandemic or by a cyber attack. And we need to think about how we change our valuations to incorporate a greater measure of resilience in our view about their ability to survive from a number of issues that we may not today be able to kind of understand. And a good example, again, talking my own book slightly, would be nowhere in an annual report by a company do they set out whether they buy insurance or not, and for what is to buy insurance versus what risks they don't. So none of this is disclosable, and investors don't insist on it. And so as a measure of a company's performance, resilience doesn't rank as highly as some of these other financial measures that I've already mentioned. And precisely this issue that you're raising is one of how do we pay for greater resilience, recognize greater resilience at a time, of course, where the world, frankly, as a whole, has less resources because we spent so much trying to recover from today's pandemic.
If you can't see it, you can't be it. If you can't measure it, you can't take it on. And this is why we're seeing so much push for measurement and for really more transparent data, whether it comes to taking on risk or whether it comes to diversity in the midst of businesses or whether it comes to them taking on climate change. We've discussed so much in terms of where we are, what the policy needs are right here, right now, and some of the key threats. Let's leave our audience, as we set ourselves up for the rest of the conference, with a dose of optimism. I'd love to hear from each of you, as we've only got a few minutes left. Just one element that you're really optimistic about heading into 2021. Odile, if I could start with you.
I would say the vaccine started from where coming back to where we start. I think the vaccine is really a positive element. And the second one, I think, is also this increased awareness on climate change. I think that we've come out from difficult times. I think the new administration in the US will really make a change in this respect because, it will create a new dynamic and facilitate. A number of countries have continued on this path, but I think that with the US on board, it will make it, we can expect that it will make a breakthrough. And I think that makes me optimist.
Glenn, a man of optimism.
Look, I think I have to pivot off something that my colleague on the panel just said. I think a cause for optimism will be right in front of us on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2021, when we return American leadership to the kind of role and approach that it has had historically. It'll be a very, very important time in American history and a very important beginning of a new optimistic time for our country and our country's role in the world.
Keisha, your perspective.
Our children leave me optimistic. Recently, my 10-year-old son said to me, I saw a lady on TV and she survived the bird flu and COVID-19. She's still here. And I think that really speaks to what we should all celebrate, that we are not the first generation that's endured hardships and we're still standing and we're still here. And that makes me optimistic.
Next generation, they always help. Bruce, your perspective.
So I join with Odile in thinking that the single cause of greatest joy for 2021 is the transportation and delivery of the vaccine. But I think I link that with an earlier comment that Glenn made in this call, which is that it actually also is a huge tribute to human ingenuity and our ability to solve problems as we have to face them. And I think putting those two things together, the great success of the vaccine, coupled with human ingenuity to solve whatever problems we're faced with, gives me a huge amount of optimism for the future.
And Kuben?
Thanks. Three quick things. I think the global economy is more resilient, and that's a positive, and should be able to bounce back, even though this downturn is much deeper. Secondly, I think everybody recognizes the need for government, for competent government, for the delivery of public goods. The private sector cannot do certain things. You need competent governments to deliver. And thirdly, I think the world's realized that unless you cooperate around a set of issues, the world's not going to be able to solve these problems. Global cooperation is absolutely necessary. And I think everybody in the world today realizes the need for such cooperation. Countries on their own can't solve this problem.
Well, today has been evidence of global cooperation and global discussion, debate, and solution finding. I want to thank our very international panel and thank the Conference of Montreal for having us and putting on such a spectacular debate. I really want to thank Odile, Renaud-Basso. Thank you so much, Glenn Hutchins, Keisha Lance-Bottoms, Bruce of Carnegie-Brown, and Kuben Naidoo. It has been a great honor speaking with you all and hearing all your points of view. And we wish the Conference of Montreal well in the next set of debates. And thank you to the audience.